going back to that special Christmas story, which I'll be reviewing at the end of 2019, Father Kramer reminds Jim Corrigan that on Christmas Eve, he actually managed to connect himself to all of the souls in New York City. And Father Kramer says to Corrigan, why don't you try that again? Reach out and connect with all the people in New York City, and you'll see that not all of humanity is bad. Not all of humanity is a lost cause. And so Jim, in the guise of the Spectre, is able to do that, and it starts turning him around and gets him to a point where he is determined to take down Asmodeus. Things don't go too well for Clarissa in the prison. She is threatened by the other inmates, who then commit what appears to be ritual suicide in front of Clarice. So she is pretty shattered. And in the end, Asmodeus decides to take Clarissa, and Douglas to the underworld, where basically where he and Jatan are going to punish Douglas and Clarice, but they're also going to punish Clarissa because she's starting to show some doubt in the deal which she made. And so fortunately at this point, Corrigan is in enough control of the Spectre that he goes to the underworld as well to confront his longtime enemies. And when he gets there, he realizes the error of his ways, and he switches the souls of Clarice and Clarissa such that they're back in their original bodies. Clarice's body is returned to its proper chronological age, and Clarice says, Jim, now you have to let me go. The only way this is going to end is if you cut that link. And so it's not easy for Jim to do this, but he does it in the end. He's also able to take down Asmodeus once and for all, and Asmodeus is actually ripped in half and reverted to being both Karaka and Succuba. So Asmodeus' plan, Lord Jatan's plan, ultimately fail. But then we get this really neat twist at the end as we see Karaka's soul, and he's feeling so tormented. He's feeling so guilty over the acts which he committed over the millennia as Asmodeus, even though he can't be held entirely responsible. He can certainly be called out for giving in to his despair, but again, he was only one half of Asmodeus. But what's really amazing is that the spirit of Clarice appears, but her spirit transforms into the soul of Devi, Karaka's wife. And Devi reveals that she's been looking for her husband over a multitude of lifetimes, and she explains that in the 1900s she was reincarnated as Clarice Winston, and the reason why she fell so strongly in love with Jim Corrigan was because on a subconscious level he reminded her of her first love and her first incarnation. And in fact, again, on a subconscious level, Devi thought that Jim was her husband reincarnated. But now she sees that that is not the case. And Karaka feels awful because he says, as Asmodeus, I did terrible things to you. And fortunately, the Spectre intervenes and says, well, yes, you must atone for this. You will have to endure a series of reincarnations. Each one will be very unpleasant. But the hope is that after so many difficult lifetimes, you will have earned your redemption and you will be allowed to come into the light. And Devi says to her husband, and I will reincarnate as well, as many times as it takes, and we will be together again one day. And so, at least for now, as they await their next reincarnation, Karaka and Devi are able to walk into the light together. Really powerful revelation. I love the way that Ostrander writes this because, again, he's not taking anything away from previous interpretations of the Spectre's origin. Everything is still there, right from day one. Clarice Winston honestly loved Jim Corrigan. She didn't know that she was a reincarnation of the deceased wife of the first human host of the Spectre, but it adds to why Clarice loved Jim so deeply, because I mean, even going back to the start, to More Fun Comics number 52, we just couldn't help but wonder, why did Clarice love this hard-boiled detective so much? And here we get it. I really like how Jim responds to this later on. There's a really neat closing scene where Jim is back on Earth and he's just reflecting on all that came in this whole arc, and he reflects upon the fact that he was reunited with Clarice, and they went through this whole trial together just now, and things have changed. He now knows exactly what was a play in their relationship. But Corrigan's inner dialogue ends with, but I still remember when Clarice was mine. So there's that tragic element still to Jim Corrigan, that as he's learning more about himself, he still has to face loss. Just as how he learned so much about himself during his time with Amy, he had to let her go. And speaking of Amy, what's really neat about this Desecration arc is that we do see Amy Baderman return, and this time she returns in a different form as part of the chaos that Asmodeus is causing. He actually raises the corpse of Amy, and he traps Nate Kane in an elevator, an office building, with the deceased, with the remains of Amy, and of course with Nate's great fear about getting disease through touch. This is terrifying, and it's Amy who comes to his rescue, and this time she's a figure of pure light, and she is able to get him out of that situation. Even though he's still afraid to touch her, what's really nice is that we see that Amy has gone to a higher level. She's now at peace. She's something much more than she was. In fact, she refers to herself as that which used to be Amy Baderman. There's also a really neat appearance by Percival Pott in this. He comes to the aid at one point, and he tells Nate that Percival Pop was there to add an assist. So just a really nice story arc in that it fleshes out some more of the history between Jim Corrigan and Clarice Winston. It gives us an origin finally for Asmodeus. A couple of great cameos. This, however, is the one story arc from Ostrander-Mandrake, which actually received a fair amount of negative criticism from fans. Looking at the letters pages for a number of the ensuing issues, there were a number of fans who were quite disturbed with the amount of violence and gore in the storyline. And certainly, story arcs that preceded this one and then came after Desecration arc were not light, family-friendly reading by any stretch. But Ostrander-Mandrake really turned things up for this arc. I get the impression that both men read the letters pages and they got a pretty clear idea as to how much was considered too much in the eyes of the fans. Certainly, there was some nudity in this story arc. Certain scenes where different characters such as Clarice, Clarissa, Madame Xanadu are in certain states of undress. So this certainly is not a story arc which I would encourage younger readers to pick up. And I would say to parents who are sharing their comics with kids, this is one of those story arcs you may want to hold back until your kids are a little bit older. But some really neat world building and character development going on in this arc. Now, following the Desecration arc, Mr. Ostrander-Mandrake afforded themselves the opportunity to tell a small handful of one-and-done or two-part stories. There was an almost obligatory two-part tie-in with the Underworld Unleashed event that was written by Mark Waid. And I read Underworld Unleashed recently, and Mark Waid himself said that this was not one of his proudest moments in comics. He admitted that this story arc, the story that he wrote, wasn't really quite up to snuff. And I get the sense that if he had the chance, he would probably go back and change certain elements of the story. It's certainly not a bad story, but certainly not the same level as other classic Mark Waid stories. Basically, in the Underworld Unleashed tie-in, Neron manages to get the Spectre to agree to a bargain which he strikes. And what the Spectre gets out of this is the ability to separate from Jim Corrigan and to be able to walk the earth, interact with other characters without being burdened by a human host. And so Corrigan first has to go to heaven to figure out what exactly is going on and why this is allowed. And by the end of that two-parter, Corrigan and the Spectre are reunited. Just want to pop back to the epilogue for Desecration storyline. Just one piece I didn't mention was what happened to Clarissa. So it turns out that her soul was condemned to hell, but the Spectre, I think out of respect for Clarice, and maybe even a little bit for Douglas, went back to hell and decided that Clarissa should not be forced to stay in hell. He realized that she had been seduced by Asmodeus, and so he decided that she would be reincarnated. And Lord Jaitan protested this, but Spectre was able to get some divine support from the Archangel Michael, and so Clarissa presumably went off to be reincarnated. Okay, so getting back on track, after those 1 or 2 part stories, Ostrander-Mandrake